Here we go. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jeffrey Archer, Dean of University Libraries, Museums, and the Press, and we're just so excited to host the President and the Office of Provost Readers Meet the Author. When you think of libraries, you think of archives and books and places to study, but this is just as important, that we have ideas before us and have an opportunity for our community to engage with authors, engage with their ideas. Before we get started, I do want to read our land acknowledgement and ask that you listen and possibly lean into the latter half. We have a framework for us to move forward. We respectfully acknowledge that Baylor University in Waco and its original campus and Independence are on the land and territories originally occupied by indigenous peoples, including the Waco and Tawakoni of the Wichita and affiliated tribes, the Tonkawa, the Comanche, Karankawa, and Lipan Apache. These indigenous peoples were dispossessed of and removed from their lands over centuries by European colonization, American expansionism. In recognition that these native nations are the original stewards of Baylor's campus locations, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign native nations and indigenous communities through educational offerings, partnerships, and community service. I want to welcome our president, Dr. Linda Livingstone, to kick off the rest of the time.
Thank you, Dr. Archer. Welcome. It's so good to have all of you with us on this beautiful, last day of January? Next to last day of January? It's wonderful. Well, this is our first Readers Meet the Author event of 2024. We had some wonderful events in the fall that I know some of you participated in. Every year, we invite some of our outstanding faculty who have been authors of books about sort of big, important ideas that cover a really wide array of topics and disciplines to share those with us and to share their scholarship. And it's a wonderful way to bring our faculty, staff, and students together to discuss these great books and then to talk about some really important topics. In 2023, we discussed books on racial division, how Baptists relate to Catholicism, and raising teenagers. I'm not sure which of those was the most difficult topic to talk about. This year, Provost Brickhouse and her team has worked to feature 7 authors in this series. And so today's event is the third in the installment for this academic year. So we have invited Dr. Felipe Hinojosa to discuss his book, Apostles of Change, Latino Radical Politics, Church Occupations, and the Fight to Save the Barrio. Last year, we were really delighted to bring Dr. Hinojosa here as the inaugural Jackson Family Chair for Baylor in Latin America. And it was a tremendous step forward, as this is one of the initiatives in Illuminate that really needed kind of a shot in the arm, and that's what you are providing. We're so excited about that. Dr. Hinojosa has joined the Baylor family at a time when topics like race, activism, and immigration are especially salient. We are excited to hear from him because he has spent years writing about the role of churches, the role churches have played in activism among Latin Americans, and the role churches can play in the world today. Book reviewers have called Apostles of Change overwhelmingly readable. That must be a real compliment to an academic, right? That it's overwhelmingly readable and expertly researched and written. So we really look forward to hearing in more depth about the book. Dr. Hinojosa has researched in the area of Chicano and Latin history, American religion, race and ethnicity, and social movements. He has 2 other award-winning books, co-editor of a book on Latino religious politics, and numerous articles on Latino studies that have appeared in a variety of journals and magazines. He is joined by Dr. Elesha Coffman. She's Associate Professor of History here at Baylor, a former journalist. Her research explores the transmission of ideas, particularly in the realm of American religious and intellectual history. She's the author of The Christian Century and the Rise of the Protestant Mainline, Margaret Mead, A 20th Century Faith, and Turning Points in American History, How Pivotal Events Shaped a Nation and a Faith. That book is being released today, so head to the bookstore and buy one when you're done here. Congratulations. That's very exciting. That's right. She'll be on our list next year. She is also the editor of Fides et Historia, a journal of history, and has published articles and essays in Christianity Today, The Washington Post. You can see her journalistic background coming out in those outlets. So thank you so much to both of you, Dr. Hinojosa and Dr. Coffman, for being with us. I'm going to turn it over to you to lead us in the conversation today.
Great. Thank you so much, President Livingstone, Dean Archer, Provost Brickhouse, and all of you for being here. We look forward to a great conversation about a really great book. So I want to start right off with a question for my office neighbor. This is your second book after a book on Latino Mennonites in 2014. Would you say that this book is more of a continuation of that earlier research or more of a departure? How did you come to this topic?
Yeah, so I would see it totally as a continuation. I think with the first book on Latino Mennonites, I grew up in the Mennonite church, so that's how people always sort of wonder how I got to that topic. But that's how it happened. And when you're looking for a dissertation topic, the biggest influence, at least for me, and I know for a lot of other graduate students that I was in school with, was, do you know where the archives are and how quickly can you get it done, right? Because it's all about a finished dissertation. And so within the church that I had grown up in, I knew where the libraries were. I knew who I had to get in touch with in terms of doing oral histories and all that. And so I went with it. So I did research in Goshen, Indiana, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Heston, Kansas, Ames, Iowa, Iowa City, Iowa, metropolis, right? There's huge cities, right? These were places where I would get done at the archives at 5, and it was like, all right, I'm just going to go back to my room and just work because there was nothing else going on. And sometimes I get lucky and have dinner with some folks, and that was great. But with doing that book, I remember I was writing a lot of Latino missions for the Mennonite Church started in Chicago. Chicago's got a long history of Mexican and Puerto Rican migration to that city throughout much of the 20th century. So it's no surprise that Mennonites having their headquarters in northwestern Indiana, that a big push to attract Latinos was to go to the city of Chicago, and African Americans, by the way, in terms of missions. And as I was writing this chapter on this Pastor Evangelico, David Castillo, who joins the Mennonite Church and becomes a pastor in the Lawndale area there in the neighborhood, I came across a story much later in the timeline of a group of radical activists, radical black activists, the Black Keystone Nation in the city of Chicago that actually occupied the Woodlawn Mennonite Church. Now, Woodlawn might not mean much to you, but if you know anything about Vincent Harding and MLK's speechwriter and a very influential person in the movement, this is where Vincent Harding started his ministry. He was a Mennonite pastor in Chicago. It's during this time and some of the years after Harding that the Black Keystone Nation occupies this Mennonite church, and I was hooked. That was it. I couldn't believe it. As somebody that grew up in the church, I could imagine myself being in that building and these radicals with berets on, looking like Che Guevara lookalikes, occupying this space and saying, we're going to turn this into a community center, bring down all your pictures of white Jesus, right, and turn this into a community center that serves the people. That was it for me. And, I'm always sort of thinking about it within Mexican-American and Latino frame. And the next thing was, I remember it was probably early 2009, January actually, 2009. I'm at the American Historical Association meeting in New York City, and I'd never been to New York City, and so I don't know what I'm doing. But I get on, I invite a friend of mine. I said, let's go up, let's take the subway, and let's go up to 111th and Lexington Avenue. And let's go find East Harlem, which is the historic Puerto Rican community. This is the place that Puerto Ricans first got to in the 1940s and the 1950s. Large numbers of them that migrated to East Harlem. I said, I want to get to know it, and I also want to go find this church, the first Spanish Methodist church in East Harlem, which is where the Young Lords, the counterpart to the Black Panthers, this sort of radical militant group of Puerto Ricans and African Americans and Dominicans and Mexicans and Cubans, anyway, that occupied this church in December 1969, right after Christmas, right? And I went there. I remember going there. I didn't know anybody. I didn't know, I didn't have any connections with historians doing work in East Harlem or anything like that. I was just finishing in grad school, I was finishing my dissertation. And I remember walking around and taking pictures of the church. Like a weirdo, I don't know, a creep, I have no idea. But I was enamored with this church. And I said, I'm gonna write the story of this church. And I get emotional just thinking about it, because those decisions you make, you never think you're gonna see them come to fruition. You never think you're gonna see that book end or finish it. And I suppose you never finish a book, you abandon it. I don't know.
You move on to
you
something
move on to something else. But that's where it started, in a very cold New York City in 2009. And I had just the time of my life. It's documented on Facebook, all of the, pictures I took to all these research places, getting to know New York City. Thank God for Google Maps to navigate the subway system and figuring out how to get to places. I also learned that as I was starting to write about that occupation, that a group of young Mexican-American Catholics at the same time across the country in Los Angeles disrupted Christmas Eve Mass. Okay, so if you're Catholic or Católico or Católica, you know just how much Christmas Eve Mass means, right? And the significance of it, right? If you don't go to church all year, you go to Christmas, you go to, it's okay. And they disrupted this. And I'll shut up. I got to tell you this story, because as soon as I found out that those two things across the country happened at the same time, I said, there's a bigger story that's happening here. And boy, it'd be cool to do research in LA, so let's do it. But right, not Ames, Iowa, right? So I'm starting to sort of look into the story, and I go to UC Santa Barbara, where all of the collections, by the way, I love libraries. Thank you to Dean Archer and to the library here for hosting this. This is incredible. I go to UC Santa Barbara, and what a beautiful campus, first of all. But I go there, and I go to the library, and I go into the archives, and the Catholic Church, if you read the book, or if you're going to read it, it's for sale back there, so hit it. The Catholic Church was the only group that prosecuted young people, all right? The Methodist, Presbyterians, those two major denominations were upset, they were frustrated, they were angry, but they didn't prosecute. The Catholic Church did. They went after these young Mexican-American kids in LA. And so the court transcript is at UC Santa Barbara. So I'm there, I'm looking through, a friend of mine, Mario Garcia, who teaches history at UC Santa Barbara, said, you gotta go through these court transcripts, they're incredible. So I go through them, it gives you sort of an insider's view of what happened December 24th and into the 25th, that night in Los Angeles in 1969. And as these young people, and it's an entire group of young people that are coming to St. Basil's Catholic Church, just west of downtown in Los Angeles, they show up, and it's just about to be midnight, and they have been gathering outside since earlier that day, and they start to go. The Cardinal McIntyre was one of the most conservative cardinals in the country. Tells the ushers to shut the doors of the church. Do not let these people in. And these young people are shouting, let the poor people in. Let the poor people into the church. And the doors are locked, and one of the kids finds a way to get in, and they get in through the side. Cardinal McIntyre knew they were coming. The ushers of the church, he had hired undercover police officers to be ushers of the church that night. So as they go in, they're met with the billy club, they're hit, they're being pushed aside, more kids are getting in. Cardinal McIntyre is hearing this melee, the church, the congregation is panicking, what is happening? And Cardinal McIntyre looks to the choir director and tells the choir director, sing. I want you to sing, get the choir going, let's drown out these voices. And you know what song they started to sing? And this is proven in the court transcripts by the choir director that night. As they were shouting, let the poor people in, the choir starts singing, "Oh, come all ye faithful." And the contradictions could not have been any worse. And so the stories hooked me in. That's how I got in. I learned of the stories in Chicago and Houston later. And each of these stories, I think, is better served as a theatrical drama. Like, you need to see this on stage, right? Like, this should be a comic book, or like something, because they're just such incredible stories. I would have never imagined as a kid growing up that anything like this would have happened. And when I spoke to folks in the church or at former students of McCormick Seminary in Chicago who have emailed me, who found the book, and they set up tent cities outside that seminary, you know, that storyline was very important to me. But the other side that really sort of hooked me in and why I decided to do it was that this was a national story. That Latinos were knocking on the door of major church bodies and saying, we are here and we ain't going anywhere.
You've anticipated / answered some of the next questions, possibly because I sent them to you ahead of time. So
No, it's because I go off and I just start talking, but ask me
fine. Well,
and
that
we'll
just
go.
means that you're going to end up getting some questions that you didn't anticipate.
That's right.
So that's,
Okay,
that's
great.
what you get.
Perfect.
But first, another one that you did anticipate. Often the story of mid-20th century American religion and the civil rights movement is very black and white in terms of race. I think that's how probably a lot of us learned it. That's how I've taught it for sure. But your story is about Latinos. How does it change what we think we know about civil rights and religion when you really foreground Latinos in the narrative?
That's a great question. I think that one of the ways that it gets us thinking is to start looking at issues of class and start to look at issues of migration and to start to look at Latin America, right? And the connections and the relationships, right? When you look at a city like Chicago, the city of Chicago in the middle 20th century was full of migrants from the Deep South, from Appalachia, from South Texas, from all over Latin America and the Caribbean. And to have a group of folks coming into neighborhoods that were like Lincoln Park that I write about in this book, that were previously populated by white ethnic populations, that came to America at a time when there was a possibility to make a living, to earn an income, to raise a family, and so forth. And to have these folks moving into these neighborhoods and the fistfights that broke out as kids, they're fighting the Italians, they're fighting the Polish kids, all of that stuff. But also the fact that deindustrialization, the deinvestment in America's inner cities in the years after World War II, all of that signaled sort of the decay and the crumbling that began to take place in terms of the lack of investment. So looking at the experience of Latinos, I think expands or helps us sort of move beyond not just a black and white binary, because it's almost it's so difficult to tell the story outside of the African American experience, primarily because folks were living close to each other. And secondly, young Latinos and Latinas were looking at black freedom fighters, right? Looking at their example in terms of taking on the nation. And many times it was African Americans that were pulling up Latinos and Latinas and saying, come here, let's join together, let's do something special. That's exactly what happened in the city of Chicago with the first Rainbow Coalition. If you all have seen the Hollywood sort of film of it, Jesus and the Black Messiah, where it chronicles the story of the first Rainbow Coalition and Fred Hampton, the leader of the Black Panther Party, the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party in Chicago, and the kinds of coalitions that form. That's, looking at class, looking at migration, all of these experiences, and on top of that, looking at how people from different backgrounds formed these multi-ethnic and multiracial coalitions that oftentimes we tell these stories in silos, right? We look at things and these experiences as Latinos and the white power structure, or African Americans and the white power structure. And I came into graduate school at a time when, in the early 2000s, where Chicano history, where Mexican American history was really making a shift historiographically and methodologically, looking much more at, okay, what does it mean to look at these relationships horizontally, right? Not just vertically, right? And how were poor African Americans relating to poor Latino immigrants in the city, right? A lot of these neighborhoods were much more diverse than I think we often give them credit for. And I think looking at Latinos kinds of expands that purview, gives us a whole different view and a whole different connection to that history. And the last thing that I'll say is, today, right now, the demographics in this country that are changing so rapidly and have already changed are making it so that our students in our classes are asking these questions, right? Latinos didn't just show up, right? And so when we start to write their history and look at it and explore it, it opens just all kinds of different avenues to rethink and refashion American history and see it not just in a way where we've sort of isolated and do ethnic studies or ethnic history or Mexican American history in these silos, but to think about how these communities related to one another. And I think those demographics are pushing us to explore that further, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is for the benefit of several of my own grad students who are in the archive research seminar. What's it like to be doing sort of living history? There's archival material, but there's also people still alive who were there for these events. How do you do that methodologically? How do you balance what might be, memories? There's all kinds of challenges of working with people's memories, but also possibly really emotionally charged stories. It can be easier to just deal with documents in an archive, but you were doing both. What was it like to do both?
So I did about 30 oral histories for this book in every major city that I wrote about, all together combined. So a few in each of these cities, and it was just when you're a kid from Texas like me, when you're from South Texas, when you're from the Valley, and you're calling somebody up from East Harlem in New York City, they're like, "Who are you?" And you're from Texas, man. Like, what are your politics, right? Like that. I mean, I had the young lords on the phone, and they were like, "I don't know who you are," And so I think the first thing was just sort of helping these folks understand that I was serious, right? That I was serious about what I was doing, and that I wanted to tell their story. These were folks that, as radical as they were, grew up evangelicals, right? Especially in East Harlem. They grew up Pentecostal. They grew up Catholic in LA and in Houston. And so asking them about that, nobody had asked them about that before, right? Nobody had asked them about how going to these Bible studies growing up in church influenced or shaped their understanding of the church when they were, grown-ups. And so I think the first thing was for me to try to build trust and to try to get them. I had one, Hiram Maristani, who was the photographer for the Young Lords, and many of the photographs that you see on the Young Lords, which are phenomenal, were taken by Hiram Maristani. And Hiram, I got him on the phone, and I think probably by, maybe 5 minutes in, he was like, "You're gonna have to send me the chapter that you're working on New York." And I mean, I don't know how much I had of it done, but you always say, "Sure, yeah." And I got as much of it done together, and I remember he sent me his email address. And, these folks were around at that time, and so they're up in age. And so I'm thinking, I'm never going to hear back from this person. He's not going to check his email. This is over, right? And I get a phone call about a week later, and, all he said was, "Which photos do you want? And what do you want permission to?" And that was my experience in Chicago. That was my experience in LA. That was my experience in Houston, in getting folks to sort of, be. This was each of these occupations, as I note in the book. I think the longest one was maybe 21 days in Houston. The rest were 11 days, 5 days in Chicago. So some of them hadn't thought about this one in quite a while. And to be able to sort of get at them and sit down and talk to them, I met a lot of incredible people. And those of you that do oral history, you know what this is about. Building trust, keeping communication lines open, even as you're working on the work. And I think the grace and the kindness that people receive me into their homes, I'll never forget being in the home of Obed and Omar Lopez, who I write about in the Chicago chapter. Obed and Omar were part of the Young Lords in Chicago, but they were Mexican immigrants. They were undocumented when they were doing the activism that they were doing in Chicago. And they were both evangelicals. They had been born in Mexico, evangelicals, and gotten to Chicago. And Obed and Omar both were enamored with the Cuban Revolution. So that that sort of marked them in terms of their politics when they get to Chicago and joining the Young Lords. But when I meet them and when I want to talk about the church, I'm not always sure that folks want to talk about church or religion or their faith. But they, I'll never forget the breakfast that they had ready for me in their home, spent an entire Saturday there with them. Those are little things and the perks of doing this work that are just beautiful, and their families that I'm still very much in touch with. Even if I'm not working on the project, I'll go to Chicago and we'll still meet for breakfast and follow up and do that. The archives were essential, primarily because I was going to archives that I think a lot of Latino and Latina historians had not really tapped, which are denominational and Presbyterian and Methodist archives at Drew University and SMU, and then the gold mine in Philadelphia, the Presbyterian archive. I keep that one a secret. I try not to, although maybe not anymore, but I try to tell people there's nothing, you're not going to find anything there. Don't go there. Because missionaries had cameras, and missionaries were taking notes, and they were writing reports, and they were documenting barrios and neighborhoods in a way that our community was too busy working to do, right? And so those narratives that, as paternalistic and as often racist as they sometimes were, you can still draw and learn things from. So it was a real, I think, benefit. And the last thing I'll say is to find, the other thing that's often hard is in the archives, finding the voices of Latino pastors was often very, very difficult for me. I got lucky in Chicago that I found the archive to the Presbyterian Latin American Caucus that had a whole collection of Latino pastors that were active during the civil rights era, complicated politically all over the place, and very, very upset that their denomination was paying attention to these young radicals and had ignored them for the last 10 years. So they used that capital from the Young Lords as much as they could. But that was a real incredible find for me as well.
Okay. Don't listen to him about not going to the Presbyterian Historical Society. You absolutely can. You absolutely should. They own the whole city. Did you get to go to the basement?
I wasn't in the basement, no.
They own the whole city block
Yeah.
of Lombard Street from 4th to 5th. It's all storage down there. And I'm trying to get one of those collections more accessible to other people. So,
Right.
Again,
So
everybody should go.
Because you bring that up, their digital collections are also incredible. So I was able, okay, I'm sorry.
We're in a library. We can talk about archives.
So go with me to Chicago, May of 1969, when the Young Lords occupy McCormick Seminary. As they're occupying the seminary, the Presbyterian Church, whatever the acronym is, you all know better than me. The Presbyterian Church is having their National Assembly in San Antonio, like at the same time. Like if they knew, one of the seminary students tells one of the Young Lords, tells Obed, they're meeting, you ought to get down there, because there was also another activist, James Foreman, who had just drafted the Black Manifesto, right? The Black Manifesto, he's asking for $500 million from white churches that got rich off of slavery, right? So money's being tossed around. Foreman is walking into Riverside Church in New York City and disrupting church services and all that. And the seminary students, the white seminary students at McCormick, which by the way were very helpful in letting them in, letting the occupation go forward, tell Obed, you ought to go to San Antonio right now. You ought to hop on a Greyhound and go. So he does that. He goes, gets on a bus and goes. Foreman finds out, says, we got to bring Lopez. You can't do this work unless you're listening to Spanish-speaking populations. Obed gets into the panel. He's up there. He's talking. The speech is recorded. They have it online at this press. I was able to find that and to share it with the Lopez brothers and to share a picture of him. He obviously had not heard that speech since he gave it, right? So it's a phenomenal moment. All right.
Okay, no, that's great. And this interplay of the more radical activists and the denominational actors is what I want to ask about next. You talk about something sociologists have identified as and I'm going to be quoting from page 5 of the book, the radical flank effect, when an action by a radical group strengthens the bargaining position for a more moderate group, that makes the demands being made by the moderate group seem reasonable. And I'd love for you to tell us how that worked in the cases you studied, but I'm also really curious if it ever backfired, if instead of the radicals boosting support for the moderates got tarred as radicals and dismissed. And I'm thinking about more recent things like any talk of police reform getting labeled a defund the police effort, or any talk about racial disparities at all getting labeled CRT, and hysteria ensues.
Great question. That theory, I think, was really proven to me by, in each of the cases. I'll focus on Chicago in terms of the Latino pastors there, that again were frustrated that Presbyterian denominational leaders were taking out their checkbooks to write checks to these young, to this Poor People's Coalition in Lincoln Park, and more specifically to the Young Lords. The Young Lords were asking for over $600,000 to keep Lincoln Park from turning into what it turned into now. If any of you have ever been to Lincoln Park or DePaul University, in terms of what it looks like now versus what it looked like in the 1960s, multi-ethnic, immigrant, migrant community that lived there. And the push from the Young Lords was to establish a Puerto Rican cultural center in that neighborhood, and to get an architectural firm from the city of Chicago to develop a plan that would create mixed income housing, or make it possible to have mixed income housing. The idea was that we're not going to push back urban renewal. It's going to happen. Let's do it on our terms then, right? Let's make it work for us in that regard. So the denomination puts up some money. They hire an architectural firm. They start working with this architectural firm and so forth. As they're doing that, these Puerto Rican pastors and Latino pastors, Mexican American and Puerto Rican, are asking, it's 1969, we've been marching with Cesar Chavez. By the way, Chavez is already doing his thing in California. We've been marching for farm worker rights. We've been boycotting lettuce and grapes. We've been trying to work to get you all to listen to the plight of Latinos in the United States. And all they can muster up is what one Presbyterian pastor said, that the Spanish-speaking sound like far-off thunder. Like they're coming, there's thunder somewhere out there, but still don't know them very well at all. And what the occupation at McCormick Seminary, what the disruption of Christmas Eve Mass, what all of these places did was give Latinos a voice within these church hierarchies, these moderate pastors, give them a voice, and more importantly, get their seminaries, the place where they train their young people to start to pay attention to what's happening in Latin America, and not just in Latin America, but on the streets of Chicago and LA and Houston and so forth. That was a major turning point, right? That was a point where these denominations, and especially seminaries like McCormick became the place early on where Latino studies was being brought into the curriculum, along with African American studies and theology. And just a few years before that, students at the seminary had been asking for more Black faculty, more Black curriculum, more, talking about what was happening in terms of the civil rights movement and so forth. McCormick establishes a Latino Studies Institute. David Carrasco, who became a major scholar at Harvard Divinity School, starts his teaching career at McCormick, largely in part to what had happened there. And they remain a major player for a number of years in terms of Latino studies. And so those openings, that's essentially what I saw, is all of a sudden these pastors, people were looking to them and beginning to acknowledge what they had done. And I think it's primarily because the idea of the farm worker movement for urban folks seems so distant. We could stop eating grapes, or we can stop doing this, or maybe help in whatever way we can, but how does it affect us in our everyday lives? And so the urban Latino experience, I think, was quite significant. To the second part of your question, I never sort of found any evidence where Latino religious communities were targeted in this way. Although there were Senate hearings around the radical clergy link-up, there was a lot of concern at the federal government in terms of the role that radical clergy were starting to play in these radical urban movements. And Chicago was a main site of that. A lot of what's happening with the Young Lords and occupying McCormick Seminary comes out of a larger neighborhood cooperative ministry group of radical clergy like Bruce and Jeannie Johnson that are in this book, the Methodist pastors that are in this book as well. So in terms of the religious side, I didn't see as much of a backlash. The backlash came to the radicals. The Latin American Defense Organization in Chicago was burned down in 1970. Much of their archives were lost. That was the office that Obed Lopez had started. In LA, 21 young people were arrested for disrupting Christmas Eve Mass. They were not arrested that night, by the way. They were beaten, but they were not arrested. They were arrested 20 days later and taken to court by the Catholic Church. Mind you, this is at the point where the Catholic Church is bragging about having its first Mexican-American bishop, Patricio Flores, in 1970. It is doing mariachi mass. It is installing this sort of cultural wave. It is taking what's happening in Latin America. It's clergy marching with Chavez. And that's all happening. And on the side, the church is bringing down the hammer on young folks that were essentially trying to fight for the same thing. So I saw it more with the activists and the radicals that the pain came down for them. And as a matter of fact, this is also, I think, one of the benefits of the oral histories that I did. When you speak to folks, they will often, and rightly so, tell you, you know, you're going to end the book in 1970 or 75, but we never stopped marching and we never stopped being targeted, right? COINTELPRO, local police authorities, the police brutality that a lot of these folks suffered, folks that were never able to hold a steady job to this day, that ended up working for the nonprofit sector or ended up having to find and make their own way from there because they had already been put into a list of radicals that were dangerous to the community, so-called dangerous, right, to the community. That was and continues to be the major, concern for me. I mean, I think about, in this moment, trying to tell a Latino history story, and in this political moment that we're in, with the attacks, as you mentioned, on CRT and diversity, equity, and inclusion, I don't know that we're going to be able to, at a national level or at the museum level, like the Smithsonian, and I can get into that if you'd like, but how Americans will learn this history, I hope is not clouded by a kind of fear like what a lot of these radicals faced.
Right. Some of my own work on 20th century mainline churches and seminaries, maybe the backlash was not as, it wasn't about imprisonment, it wasn't about burning stuff down, but a longer term defunding of seminaries, distrust toward some of the seminaries and the denominational hierarchy. There had been for the last 40, 50 years the narrative of why did liberal, mostly white Protestantism decline? Well, it's because they stopped preaching the gospel or they didn't have as many babies. Right. There's some newer scholarship saying they just got too radical. Even the churchy moderates got too radical for too many people in the denomination because they were talking about racial justice. They were talking about real cultural change. So, yeah, maybe it's a slow burn.
And I mean, I think even within Latino religious studies, scholars have oftentimes maybe not paid much attention to the civil rights movement because there's been a focus on church growth or people in the pews. And if the movement didn't contribute to that, then is it worthy of study within religious studies? You know, looking at the numbers rather than looking at the imagination, at the ideas, at what this meant for churches like the one that I grew up in that tapped into this tradition of social services and community engagement.
What's something that really surprised you in the course of doing this work? Something you discovered or something about the writing process that you hadn't anticipated?
The choir singing "Oh Come All You Faithful" in LA was a big one. The other one was just how significant religion was to the Latino freedom movement. We haven't done enough work on that front in terms of bringing really that to the core. When I was in grad school, starting being in Chicano history grad seminars, there were no books on religion that were assigned in our history seminars, right? I was always the one talking about it, and the people there were usually like, all right, Hinojosa, go write your book and, leave us alone. We're talking about the serious stuff here. And whenever I wanted to get onto a panel at a conference, which is really important for a grad student, right? Be like, I read about the civil rights movement too. Like, yeah, but it's religion. I don't know. Are you going to pray? What are you going to, I don't understand. So I was always, the title of the panel was like the Chicano movement and beyond. I was beyond. That was me. So I've been committed from the beginning to engage my colleagues in history and to get them thinking about the significance of religion. Because when you interview these folks, labor activists from LA, trade union guys, strong, really committed organizing, people that were central to the movement, they can't stop talking about just how important the church was. And you think about Los Angeles or the Chicano movement in LA, it's not even that these are hard to find, that these stories are hard to find. The Church of the Epiphany in Los Angeles, Episcopalian Church, was the center of the Chicano movement in LA. Juan Gomez Quiñones, who was a historian for a long time at UCLA, called it the center of the party. It was the place where everything was happening. La Raza newspaper was being printed in the basement of the church. All of the Brown Berets, the most militant Mexican Americans, were meeting in the basement of that congregation. So it's almost like the ignorance has been intentional, right? That folks have just been intentional about leaving the church out. And I get it. Part of it is the colonial past, right? Latinos who, for the most part, grew up Catholic and have a disdain toward the politics of the Catholic Church, for sure. But that should not dissuade us from the significance of it in the movement. But that was, I think, another big surprise. I think I was trying to, when I was interviewing folks, and especially folks that have never stepped foot into the church after that occupation in all of these years, that I was going to get some sort of, yeah, that happened then, but religion was maybe partial, or clergy didn't really help us that much, or whatever. There's a quote in there that I have about Bruce and Jeannie Johnson, who, by the way, were killed brutally in their home. The case in Chicago remains unsolved. It's still a cold case. These Methodist pastors that were killed. Jose Chacha Jimenez, the founder of the Young Lords, a gang member in the 50s in Chicago, transformed to a political activist and neighborhood leader in Chicago, was at the funeral and has delivers a beautiful eulogy in terms of what the Johnsons meant, right? It was something for the Johnsons to say, you can use the Armitage Methodist Church, right, from Monday through Saturday for a daycare center. Think about working moms that needed help during the week, a health clinic. They were getting students from Northwestern, med students, to come down to Lincoln Park to do tuberculosis testing. They did it in New York with Columbia medical students, to bring them down to the First Spanish Methodist Church to get public health care access to the people. And when it wasn't happening, they just stole an X-ray truck. There's a great picture of that. They stole an X-ray truck, they put it in neutral, and they pushed it all the way to the barrio in East Harlem. And there's great pictures of cats right on top of the truck like that, and folks getting tested and getting access to public health. When I was working on this, and then I'm wrapping it up, and then we hit the pandemic. And the beauty of watching my students and all of us, really, neighbors, all of that, on Twitter, on social media, looking out for each other. This person needs groceries, go check in on that person. We got to do this, let's raise money, let's do this, let's do that. It reminded me a lot of what young folks were doing in the late 60s in these churches.
Mm-hmm. At this point, we can open it up for questions from all of our wonderful audience members, and we get to use the fancy mic, the Squawk Box.
Oh yeah, that's cool.
So it's worth asking a question just to be able to play with the Squawk Box, I would think.
Thank you, Dr. Hinojosa. That was really wonderful, and I need to pick up your book. A question I had, and maybe you address this more in the book, but You were talking about how at that time, the Roman Catholic Church, they had the first Latino bishop, mariachi mass. They were kind of embracing Latino culture in a sense. But yet, when it came to labor and economics, that's where the shoe dropped.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, any more thoughts on that? And I think that might be particularly relevant today too, even thinking about liberal folk who might be very ready to embrace culture, but as soon as economics come up, it becomes a totally different thing.
Yeah.
I'd just be curious on your thoughts.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I appreciate it. And I think sort of thinking about this is first and foremost a conservative institution and a powerful one and a wealthy one, right? Cardinal McIntyre, who was in leadership at the time and had been since the 1940s, had a history. He was a Wall Street banker. This is a person that came from feria, money, right? And to have him, sort of hold authority over LA at the time. People think of California as progressive and all that, but Catholics were more progressive in San Antonio at this time than they were in Los Angeles because, and a big part of that was Cardinal McIntyre. Right when the young people are arrested, at the end of January 1970, Cardinal McIntyre retires. And I think, and this I've debated with Catholic folks about this, but I credit what Católicos por la Raza did, what that group did disrupting Christmas Eve Mass, because in his retirement speech, when he alerts the community of the decision he's making, he says something to the effect, and I'm paraphrasing, there's a new spirit blowing and I'm not the person to lead at this time, right? So I think there's a section of that church that gets it. And I think within each of, whether we're talking about mainline denominations or whether we're talking about Catholicism or even Pentecostalism, that there are subsections within that of folks that are, progressive in their thinking. They believe in creating a new society, a new church, wanting to change all of that. And the forces are always there to sort of push back against that change. Those voices often come from the margins, as they did with Católicos por la Raza. I don't know in terms of how you change that or how you do that, but I do know that the idea that Católicos had, this young group of, it was really a who's who of activists. Welfare mothers, Immaculate Heart nuns were a part of Católicos por la Raza. People that had never been inside of a church were a part of Católicos por la Raza, right? To bring that coalition together and to really sort of push back against a new St. Basil's church that had just been built that cost $2 to $3 million to build, I think gives us a sense of, I don't know if it's duty, responsibility, whatever it is, to always push back against that power structure and to see the ways in which other folks have done it historically, I think is really powerful, for sure. Yeah.
Professor Hinojosa, your colleague, Professor Johnson, has a question. You touched on this a little in your description of the book. How do you hope your book will lead to a more integrated multicultural method for researching and teaching the civil rights movement in the United States?
Well, I hope we break out of those silos, right? I hope we see that our freedom is tied to one another, that we're not free until everyone's free, right? If we think about it in that way, it makes the research a lot harder. It makes the historiographical discussion and the literature review a lot more difficult, but I think it's a necessity given the demographics in the country today, the way that this university is changing, the way Baylor's changing, the way our neighborhoods and all of that have been changing now for a long time, I think necessitates that kind of multi-ethnic, multiracial look at American history and U.S. history and what it means. I think the other is to really highlight a radical tradition within Latino religious studies and to bring that forward. I get really frustrated with pundits in the media that as soon as they start to see a kind of increase in Latino votes for Trump, that somehow is to be blamed on Pentecostals, that's somehow to be blamed on people that are of faith, right? I don't buy into that at all, right? I think people in the church and outside of the church are doing that. They're voting for a variety of reasons, but it's not just tied to their religious commitments and so forth. And so to be able to take this to my community, to my church community, and I think that overwhelmingly readable, like that's all about thinking about my book. Even as I'm writing it and I'm thinking about promotion in the history department and all of that, I'm thinking about Sunday schools, I'm thinking about Bible studies, I'm thinking about my parents and my dad and mom being able to read my book and being able to say, what can we do and what can we learn from this? Even the folks that lived through it, right? Like my parents who were around at that time and are reading my book and sort of having a discussion with me and then taking it to their small congregation in Los Fresnos, Texas, right? To be able to do that for me is a privilege. So, you know, my agenda is in academia, let's break out of these silos and let's write books in a way that communities and our people and our folk can understand it, right? I mean, there's no use to do something, spend all this time and all this work, and then have it collect dust somewhere, right? And historians, we got to do this better, because oftentimes, and I have some of my students are here, but sometimes students will come into my class and say, history is the worst. This is the class I don't want to be a part of. And yet it matters more now, I think you all would agree with me, than it has, or maybe it matters just as much as it did in 1969 today.
Maybe one more question from the floor, or I have one if, oh, we got.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hinojosa. Appreciate that. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about the potential global or transnational connections, especially as it relates to Latin America. You mentioned Cuba. But during this time, there's lots of dictatorships happening in Latin America, most of them US supported and with the backing of Catholic Church and conservative sectors of a small but growing Protestant side to and institutions. So I wonder if you could say, I understand that affect migration flows, you mentioned that, but did you encounter any kind of explicit ideological inspirations from the radicals in Latin America that are fighting revolutions in their own context?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I think it goes to Dr. Coffman's earlier question in terms of thinking about how doing Latino history kind of reorients us, right, to get us to think transnationally and globally. And you're exactly right. That's exactly what's happening. I think too often that sort of traditional historiographical line is, you know, everybody looks to Latin American liberation theology to help us explain what's happening in the US, and people forget that they're happening at the same time, right? And I think folks are just, I mean, the first draft of Gustavo Gutierrez's book is taking shape around liberation theology, sort of taking shape around this time. And so what's happening, and when we do Latino studies, these activists that were very neighborhood focused, if you look at the book, this is a neighborhood, this is a barrio book, right? This is East Harlem, Lincoln Park, Northside Houston, and Lincoln Heights, and west of downtown in Los Angeles. These are areas on all of these major cities, major points of immigration throughout the 20th century, right? And so to be able to sort of think about just how focused they were on fighting urban renewal, even as they were focused on the decolonial project overseas and in their home countries, or in Puerto Rico in particular, the Young Lords in particular. Mexican Americans and the Chicano movement during this time are looking to 1848, to the US war against Mexico and that colonial project and what that meant in terms of building and searching for a history that they could use to inspire them as well. The contemporary moment in '69 was also one of influence, where Puerto Ricans and Mexican Americans are looking to Latin America. The Cuban Revolution, as you mentioned, first and foremost, this is what the big clash at the First Spanish Methodist Church in East Harlem is with the Young Lords and the Pastor Evangelico, who just happened to be Cuban, right? And we're talking 10 years after the revolution, right? And so Juan Gonzalez, who was a young lord at that time, says there's no way he was letting us into that church. You know, we all look like Che Guevara. You know, he's not going to have anything with us, right? But even more so than that, the politics that are emerging around this time on Catholic youth movements, on grassroots organizing, not seminary, not liberation theology, but grassroots student movements in Mexico City in '68 that young people in the U.S. are looking toward to form third world solidarities, right, and to build their movements on. The example that comes to mind is the theologian and philosopher Ivan Illich, who before he's in Cuernavaca and has his language school and is doing his thing there, he's in Washington Heights in New York City. He goes to Cuernavaca, establishes his work there, and Paul Guzman from New York City, Puerto Rican, goes to Cuernavaca to study Spanish. He comes back saying, "Call me Pablo." Okay, so that tells you something in terms of the political shift. But when Pablo goes to Cuernavaca and spends time with Illich there, he brings visions back of a revolutionary Christ. So that in terms of the occupation and what it means to them, this is not just a movement to stop urban renewal. It's not just a movement to get the church interested in social services. This is a larger movement to redefine Christianity at its root and to talk about the revolutionary Christ in the Gospels and to bring that back and to sort of educate a community where Felipe Luciano would say, you know, the Bible was being shoved down our throats in East Harlem. We knew the Bible. We didn't know it in this revolutionary way. And I think that's sort of the opening ground to sort of look at those relationships that are happening in terms of thinking about revolution and the power of the church at this time.
Provost Brickhouse, would you like to close us out and tell us about the next event?
Absolutely. So actually, if I may, can I ask one quick question?
Oh, absolutely.
You can give a short answer. But I've been dying to ask the question. And that is, one of the things that I found interesting in the book was the relationship between the Latino communities and the churches that are in the community,
Right.
but not really of the community.
Yeah.
Not fulfilling the needs of the community. And so there's almost like this antagonistic, you know, the relationship is in some respects strained.
Yeah.
Other forms of church that are more localized, decentralized, like your own, the Mennonite church, I mean, do they provide a better way of relating to local communities that don't have the hierarchy of the church, so that they can be a more part of those communities and the social justice concerns that they have in those communities?
Yeah, I definitely think so. And I mean, I think for the church that I grew up in, I didn't realize it at the time, obviously. I was just dreading going to church. But, you know, we were a sanctuary movement church. Casa Oscar Romero, which was a huge hub for refugees from Central America, is a mile down the road in our church. But it wasn't something that the church sort of got together and said, we need to help Casa Oscar Romero. Casa Oscar Romero comes to the church and says, we need more space. Can you help us? And that was a game changer. The church said yes, and things radically transformed. I think of these spaces, the churches that I write about that are in these barrios, that are embedded in these barrios, the lessons that these churches took are lessons that are still there. Prime example is the Northside Presbyterian Church, Juan Marcos Presbyterian Church in Houston, that, you know, the pastors, as soon as the occupation ended, they had never done this before, but they were committed to having the breakfast continue, the breakfast program, right? To continue. So the pastor's wife and everybody in the neighborhood starts to take toasters and eggs and all of that to make that a reality. Those were things that they were taking from what had just happened and saying, how can we now do it in our way, our form, however it is, but that was a pretty good idea and we're going to make it happen. I think there's a possibility that radicals, that outsiders, that antagonists to the church probably have some good ideas, and I hope we listen.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Please thank the presenters
Thank you.
today. Thank you, Elesha. And Felipe, I'm just sorry you don't care more about your work.
I'm going to try it. Being here at Baylor, it's forcing me to care more about it.
I would like to invite you all to the next Reader Meet the Author event, which will be February 15th David Lyle Jeffrey will be talking about his book, We Were Peculiar People Once, Confessions of an Old-Time Baptist. And this might surprise you. It's really funny. I just started it. It's a memoir. And so I think the emphasis is on peculiar. So anyway, I will just kind of whet your appetite a little bit. Doug Henry, Dean of the Honors College, will be here for that. So thank you for coming. Thank you for your interest, and thank you so much for your work.
Thank you.
Thanks.